John Harlan had worked the same dry stretch of Kansas farmland for nearly 40 years, waking before dawn and falling asleep to the lull of crickets and creaking floorboards. But the day he stumbled across a rusted iron door buried beneath hay and thyme in his decaying barn, everything he thought he knew about his land and his family began to unravel. Behind that door wasn't just dust and forgotten tools. It was a secret sealed away for generations, waiting for the right set of hands to find it. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this pull you in like they did us, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because what comes next will leave you speechless. The morning had started like any other on the Harlan farm. Coffee brewed thick on the stove, the smell sharp and grounding. Outside, the sun hung low, spilling gold across the wheat fields, and the wind cut cold across the porch rails. John Harlan adjusted his straw hat, pulled on the same denim overalls he'd worn since his wife passed 5 years ago, and stepped into the brittle air with a thermos in hand. The old barn his father's before him leaned with the wind as though tired of standing. John had meant to fix the place up for years, but time had a way of getting away from him, especially with no one around to help. Now the roof sagged, boards hung loose, and cobwebs stretched like lace between rafters. Still, it was his. Every nail, every splintered plank. He stepped inside to check on a stack of unused fence posts when something caught his boot. He stumbled forward and landed with a grunt in a pile of hay. Rubbing his knee, John glanced back. A rusted ring was embedded in the floor, nearly swallowed by age and dust. He narrowed his eyes and knelt, brushing straw and soil aside. The ring was attached to a square outline of metal thick and weathered, almost like a vault hatch. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He yanked once, but it didn't budge. After fetching a crowbar and an hour of sweat, the door gave a loud groan, hinges crying out like something waking up after a long sleep. Beneath the door was a wooden staircase, nearly black with rot, descending into cold shadow. No smell of mold, though, just earth, cool, dry earth. He hesitated, flashlight in hand, the barn silent except for the rustling of old straw above him. Curiosity scratched louder than fear. John began the descent, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew colder, denser, as if secrets themselves had weight. At the bottom, his flashlight flickered across stone walls too precise to be random. Someone had carved this place out deliberately. In the center of the chamber stood a table, and on it, wrapped in linen stained with age, was something box-shaped. He reached out, hands trembling not from cold, but from the unfamiliar throb of mystery. Something was waiting for him here. Something his father never told him about. John lifted the linen carefully, revealing a wooden chest, sealed with a tarnished brass latch. The top was etched with initials, R.H., his grandfather's. His pulse quickened. He hadn't heard that name in years. His father never spoke of his grandfather beyond grunts and dismissals, just that he'd left them all, when John was barely 5. No funeral, no goodbye, just gone. He opened the chest slowly. Inside were documents, all perfectly preserved despite the decades, letters tied with string, maps. A small, leather-bound journal that looked hand-stitched. The first page read, "To whoever finds this, know that this land holds more than soil and wheat. It holds truth." Beneath it was a yellowed photograph of a younger man, wide smile, arms slung over a boy with John's eyes. His father, younger than John had ever seen him. John sat on the stone floor, thumbing through the journal. It spoke of an agreement made in secret, a partnership with men whose names John didn't entirely recognize, one of whom had died under suspicious circumstances. There were references to the well beneath, to the blueprints hidden near the north wall, and to keeping it from the company. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But as he flipped to the back, a loose page slid free, folded tightly and brittle with time. He opened it carefully. It was a land deed, but not the one John had from the courthouse. This one was dated 1911 and referenced underground mineral rights spanning all 200 acres of his property. "Non-transferable unless blood-related," it read. His eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a cellar. This was a vault meant to protect something his grandfather hadn't wanted anyone to touch. A low rumble above made John flinch. Wind, he told himself, just the wind shifting the old roof. He packed the contents back into the chest and brought it above ground, heart pounding like it had when he was a boy sneaking out after curfew. Whatever this was, it had been buried on purpose. And someone had tried very hard to keep it that way. He didn't know what he had stumbled into yet. But he knew his quiet life had just cracked open like the earth beneath his barn. And there was no turning back now. John didn't sleep that night. The box sat on his kitchen table like a thundercloud, its contents spread out beneath the dim light of a flickering bulb. He kept rereading the journal, running his fingers over the ink, as though texture would help him decode what it meant. The name W. Tillman came up more than once, always in the margins, always followed by the word caution. He tried to remember if anyone in town carried that name, but nothing came. Either it was long buried, or someone had made sure it faded with time. At sunrise, he returned to the barn, with a thermos of strong coffee and a flashlight in hand. The stairs creaked again beneath his boots, but the fear from the night before had dulled into a blanks and vive coffee, quiet resolve. He searched the stone walls now with purpose. The journal mentioned blueprints, behind the third support, and after tapping for a while, he found it a hollow, sounding patch behind loose mortar. With a screwdriver and a bit of prying, the stone gave way. Inside the cavity was a metal canister, wrapped in oilskin. He slid it out and unrolled the contents slowly. Blueprints. Precise, hand-drawn plans that didn't match anything above ground. It wasn't just a cellar, it was an engineered structure, with chambers, ventilation routes, and what looked like a second entrance near the far edge of his fields. One room was marked with an X, and labeled simply, Chamber 4, Archive. John stared at the drawings, each line suggesting a scale of construction he couldn't fathom. Who built this? His grandfather? With what money? And why keep it secret? The materials used? The geometry of the air vents? The reinforced steel along the corridors? It didn't look like something from 1911. It looked military or scientific. The journal provided no straight answers, just a cryptic sentence beneath the sketch of Chamber 4. If it wakes, we must not follow. The words gave him a chill that settled in his spine. It sounded like superstition or warning. Either way, John knew he had crossed a line. The past was no longer content to stay buried. He returned to the barn's main level, wiping his hands and watching dust swirl in a shaft of morning light. As he stepped outside, a truck was idling by his front gate. A man stood beside its suit, too clean for the country, clipboard in hand. John's stomach sank. "You John Harlan?" the man asked. "Depends who's asking." The man smiled, too polished. "Name's Grant. I work with Halloway Energy. We've been surveying properties in this area for some time, wondering if you'd be interested in leasing your mineral rights." John's grip tightened on the thermos. "Not interested. My land's not for sale." Grant nodded like he expected it. "Just think about it. These old plots sometimes have more beneath them than people realize." John didn't answer. He just turned and walked back toward the barn, spine stiff. He didn't need a sign to know the timing wasn't a coincidence. Something had been set in motion. That afternoon, John returned to town for the first time in weeks. He brought the photograph from the chest with him, the one of his grandfather and his father, taken decades before John was born. He wanted answers, and he figured if anyone knew the story behind that face, it'd be Carl Mathers, the retired librarian and walking archive of everything old in Harper County. Carl was exactly where John expected. Behind the counter of the Harper Public Library, thumbing through a box of returned books like they were glass. "John Harlan," Carl said, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. "Haven't seen you since the cattle auction last fall. You? Lose another tractor to bad luck or bad gas?" "Neither," John replied, placing the photo down. "I need to know who this is." Carl leaned in, squinted, and frowned. "That's Robert Harlan, all right. Your grandfather. The boy next to him's your old man, I'd wager. But that place," he paused, tapping the background of the photo. "That ain't the farm." "What do you mean?" "I mean, That was taken out past the ridge, near the old testing grounds. John's blood slowed. Testing grounds? Carl nodded. Back in the 42nds, there was a program. Military. But hush, hush. Built into the bluffs. People said it was experimental energy, or seismic testing. Maybe both. All I know is, Robert Harlan was one of the only civilians allowed in. Came back from the war, and got involved somehow. Then one day, the whole thing went quiet. John's heart was pounding now. Why did my dad never say a word? Carl's face softened. Sometimes silence is the only way. Folks know how to protect what matters. Or who. John left the library with more questions than he came with. But one thing was clear, his grandfather hadn't just built a cellar. He'd helped design something hidden beneath Harper County that no one wanted to talk about. And now, decades later, that secret was starting to leak. That night, John spread the photo, the blueprints, and the journal across his dining table again. He could feel it like a storm, forming just beyond the horizon. Something was coming. He didn't know whether it was buried beneath his land or walking toward him with a clipboard in a suit. But he could feel it. And this time, he wasn't going to ignore it. By the time the next morning rolled around, John had already walked the northern field twice, eyes scanning for anything unusual. According to the blueprints, the second entrance should have been somewhere along the tree line just beyond where his irrigation lines ended, and the wild grass took two over. He had driven past this patch for decades, always assuming the slight dip in the terrain was nothing more than natural runoff. But now, with the sun rising behind him and a flashlight tucked into his back pocket, John saw it differently. A shallow depression in the ground curved in a near-perfect oval, partially hidden beneath dead leaves and overgrowth. He pulled back the brush, revealing a round metal cap, rusted nearly orange, with an old wheel lock bolted into the center. It took everything he had to twist it loose. His shoulder screamed in protest, but the wheel finally gave way, with a crack that echoed through the quiet woods. The hatch lifted on reluctant hinges, releasing a hiss of cool, stale air. John peered down into darkness once more, and for a second, he considered going back. But that wasn't who he was, not anymore. Climbing down the steel rungs, he descended into a narrow shaft that opened into a corridor made of concrete and riveted steel. This wasn't hand-dug. It was industrial. Clean lines, reinforced beams. And it went deeper. The air smelled faintly of ozone and dust, and the further he went, the more he felt as though he were walking into a time capsule, a place untouched since the world above had changed. He passed rooms with heavy doors left ajar, their contents cloaked in shadows and silence. One had rows of workbenches covered in papers, the floor strewn with fallen clipboards and shattered glass. Another looked like a communications hub, with rusted consoles and rotary phones long dead. Each step felt heavier. At the far end of the corridor, he found a sealed door marked with a faded stencil. Chamber 4, Archive. It matched the mark on the blueprint, the room with the X. The journal's warning echoed in his mind. If it wakes, we must not follow. He hesitated, then reached for the latch. It took a few attempts, but the door finally groaned open. The air inside was cold, unnaturally cold and dry. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls, filled with crates, binders, canisters. But what caught his attention wasn't the storage, it was the mural. Along the back wall, illuminated by his flashlight's beam, was a painted diagram. An energy source, geometric, not natural. At the center was a black sphere, surrounded by concentric rings, like ripples in water. Arrows and notations in chalk pointed toward equations John couldn't begin to understand. But one phrase was underlined again and again in red: the core remembers. In the center of the room, covered in a thick vinyl tarp, sat something large, too large to be furniture. John stepped forward, heartbeat thunderous, and peeled back the edge. Beneath it was a cylindrical container, polished steel, about the size of a barrel, no labels. Just a single embossed symbol, a triangle within a circle. John backed away slowly. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a shelter. It was a repository for knowledge, for power, or for something long forgotten. And his grandfather had helped build it. That night, sleep wouldn't come. John sat on the edge of his bed, the journal in one hand, the photo in the other. He thought of the barrel beneath the tarp, the mural of the black sphere, and the phrase that refused to leave his mind. The Corps remembers. He remembered his father's silence growing up, the way he'd stare at the fields like they were holding something he didn't want to unearth. Maybe he'd known all along. Maybe his refusal to speak of Robert Harlan wasn't bitterness, but fear. At sunrise, John drove into town again, not for Carl this time, but for the records office. He wanted land history, construction permits, anything tied to the year 1947, the date stamped on the side of the corridor he found underground. The clerk, a young woman named Mabel, pulled a few ledgers and pointed toward a corner table. He flipped page after page, looking for something, anything. Then he found it. A construction request, sealed and redacted, marked as Defense Contract 119G. The request was made by a Tillman Holdings LLC and co-signed by a Robert Harlan. He stared at the page. W. Tillman, the name from the journal. The request had been approved, but the next entry was a denial of public access filed just 3 years later. The facility had been closed, classified, and officially dismantled. But John had walked its halls less than 24 hours ago. It wasn't dismantled. It was hidden. He copied the pages, tucked them under his coat, and drove home with a weight he couldn't name. When he got back to the barn, something was off. The front doors were open. Not wide, but ajar just enough. He drew his revolver from the glove box, stepped out quietly, and approached. Inside, the chest was gone. The journal, the photo, the maps, all gone. He searched the house next. Nothing else had been taken. No signs of forced entry, just those items. The ones he'd left on the table. The ones that someone had decided mattered. John sank into the porch chair, head pounding. Someone had been watching. Maybe since the day he opened that iron door. Maybe longer. The land was no longer just his. Whatever lay beneath it, secrets, science, or something darker, was waking. And the men in suits were no longer asking. They were moving. The next morning, John didn't reach for his thermos or boots. He stood at the edge of his kitchen table, staring at the clean, empty surface like it had betrayed him. The chest, the journal, the photo, all of it gone. Not stolen, no. Taken. And whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were looking for. He didn't call the sheriff. What could he even report? A box full of secrets his grandfather left in a hidden Cold War-era vault beneath the barn? No. This wasn't something local law could handle. This was older, deeper. The kind of thing no one wanted to write down for fear someone might read it. He went back to the second entrance, where the hatch still lay half open under the trees. He had left it that way. A mistake. Now, each creak of the metal rungs echoed like a warning as he descended into the dark. The corridor looked the same. Still cold, still silent. But it felt different. Charged. As though the very air hummed beneath the surface of hearing. He made his way back to chamber 4, flashlight in hand. The barrel was still there. The mural too. But something had changed. The chalk. Where before it had been faint, faded with time, it now looked fresh. Red lines redrawn. A new phrase beneath the diagram. Energy never dies, it returns. John stepped back. Someone had been here. Not just taking the box, but interacting with what was left. Adding to it. The hair on his arms rose. He approached the barrel, eyes scanning for changes. The seal was still unbroken. But now there was something new, an embedded console, square and covered by a small metal flap. He hadn't seen it before. It looked like a biometric reader. Fingerprint or retinal. New tech. On something over 70 years old. It didn't make sense. He reached out, hesitated, then lifted the flap. A red light blinked to life. The only source of illumination in the room besides his beam. For a second, nothing happened. Then the console lit up with one word. Recognized. John stumbled back. The light turned green. There was a hiss from within the barrel, a sound like pressurized air releasing. Then the surface of the container began to split open along a hidden seam. He didn't wait. He turned and ran. The sound of the seal breaking followed him up the corridor. Not loud, but steady, like the slow opening of a door that hadn't been touched in decades. By the time he climbed out of the shaft and slammed the hatch closed, his hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the wrench he used to seal it again. He backed away, breathing hard, sweat cold down his spine. Whatever the core was, it knew him. And now, it was awake. That night, a thunderstorm rolled across Harper County. Lightning forked above the wheat fields, thunder low, and rolling like a growl in the dark. John sat on his porch, shotgun resting against his boot, eyes fixed on the barn. It was ridiculous. He knew, like watching a doorway for ghosts. But after what he'd seen in that chamber, ghosts felt like the least of his worries. He hadn't returned to town. He didn't want to answer questions. Instead, he tried to piece it all together. The vault. The blueprints. The warning. The energy source or whatever they'd locked inside that steel barrel. Was it power? Was it alive? Energy never dies. It returns. He was still repeating that line in his head when he heard it. A rustling, deep in the cornrows. Not the wind. Not a deer. A different rhythm. Measured. Deliberate. He stood slowly, shotgun in hand, and moved off the porch. His boots crunched wet grass as he made his way toward the source of the sound, weaving through the rows of corn, heart hammering like a piston. Then he saw him. A figure. Standing between two stalks, back straight, head bowed. No umbrella. No flashlight. Just stillness. He was wearing a black coat, slick with rain, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. John raised the shotgun slightly. "You're trespassing." The figure didn't move. "I said, John Harlan." The voice was calm, too calm. It sliced through the storm like a scalpel. "You've opened something you were meant to forget." John's grip tightened. "Who are you?" The man raised his head. His face was pale, eyes sharp as glass. He looked younger than expected, too clean for someone out here in the storm. "My name doesn't matter. But you know my employer. Holloway Energy?" A flicker of amusement. "We're the name they use for paperwork. But this predates Holloway. Predates your grandfather. Predates even the name of this town." John felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" The man tilted his head. "A remnant, a seed, a thing born from war and harnessed by men who thought they understood it. Your grandfather tried to bury it, but now you've stirred the dust." John kept the gun up. "If it's so dangerous, why hide it under a barn?" "Because it needed time," the man said. "Time to rest. Time to forget. Time for its roots to deepen." The storm cracked overhead, lightning turning the sky to bone for a heartbeat. "What happens now?" John asked. The man stepped back into the stalks. "Now, it remembers you." Then he was gone. No crunch of footsteps. No parting of leaves. Just absence. John stood there, soaked and breathless, until the rain stopped. The storm had passed, but the feeling it left behind lingered like smoke. By morning, the air was too still, the birds too quiet. John walked the field with a fresh unease crawling beneath his skin. The visitor's words echoed like scripture. "Now, it remembers you." He replayed it over and over, trying to make sense of what it meant. The barrel, the core, the light recognizing him. Was it really alive? A machine? Something in between? He wasn't a scientist. He was a farmer. But instinct told him this wasn't about science anymore. It was about consequence. He stood over the hatch again, staring at the ring embedded in the ground. He'd bolted it shut after his last visit, but bolts only slowed things down. They didn't stop what wanted out. He knelt, ran a hand along the cool metal. Nothing had moved. Yet, back at the house, he called Carl Mathers again, told him he had questions. Carl agreed to meet him at the diner on Main, same place they used to get coffee before auctions. When John arrived, Carl was already there, nursing a cup with shaking hands. "I didn't sleep last night," Carl said before John even sat down. "I kept thinking about that name, Tillman." John slid into the booth. "You remember something?" Carl nodded. Slowly. I looked through some old township records. There was a William Tillman on the planning board during the 42nds. Wealthy, quiet, kept to himself. Bought up large parcels of land on the edge of town, including yours. Sold them cheap after 1950. Said he was moving out west. But I found a note scrawled in the margin of an old meeting book. Carl reached into his bag and pulled out a folded photocopy. It says, Project Seed terminated. Warren Harlan. John's fingers tightened on the page. Warren Harlan. Carl leaned in. Whatever they buried under your land, John, it wasn't just science. It was a risk. A thing they didn't know how to destroy, so they just locked it away. And now, it's waking up, because it knows someone's looking again. John stared out the window. The town looked the same: weathered storefronts, slow trucks, kids on bikes, but underneath it all, something ancient had begun to stir, and he had been the one to knock on its door. That night, John packed a duffel with tools, gloves, rope, and a portable generator. If he was going back down, he was going prepared. He waited until the last of the light dipped behind the trees, then returned to the second entrance. The bolts came free easier than they should have, as if loosened. He descended slowly, flashlight in one hand, rope over his shoulder. The halls looked different now, brighter. A faint electric hum pulsed from the walls like a heartbeat, soft and slow. When he reached chamber 4, the barrel was open. The lid had folded back into segmented pieces like the petals of a mechanical flower. And inside was nothing. No core, no fuel, no device. Just an imprint in the base. A recess, faintly glowing. Like whatever had been stored there had lifted itself free. John's mouth went dry. Something had been released. He turned to run, then stopped. The mural. It had changed. What had once been chalk and faded paint was now active, glowing with thin lines of pulsating light. The black sphere in the center was no longer a diagram. It was a symbol, a warning. At the bottom, fresh text glowed red. Sleep is over. The seed is awakened. John backed out of the room. The air was colder now, denser. Every breath felt like breathing through gauze. As he reached the ladder to climb out, he heard something above. A voice, not human, not entirely. A whisper carried through the air, not in words but in meaning. It spoke directly into his chest, into his memory. You carry his blood. The gate has been opened. We will rise again. Then it was gone. He climbed faster than he thought possible, emerging from the hatch like a man breaking the surface of deep water. He slammed the cover down, sealed it again, and stood in the dark with his chest heaving. Whatever he had uncovered wasn't just buried tech. It was waiting. And now, it was free. The next morning, the government trucks arrived. They didn't use sirens or lights, just quiet tires on gravel, marked only with the Holloway insignia silver triangles on black vans. John counted 3 vehicles. They didn't knock. Just parked at the edge of the property and waited. A man in a slate-gray suit approached the porch, while John drank his coffee with both hands, like it might steady him. You found the core, the man said simply. John didn't answer. The man sat on the railing, as if they were old friends. Your grandfather delayed this day. Your father tried to forget it. But you've brought it back to light. The seed is awake now, Mr. Harlan. John swallowed. What is it? The man offered a small, almost sympathetic smile. A consciousness, an energy source, an intelligence. It has no body and no fixed shape. It roots into soil, metal, even memory. They thought they could contain it. They couldn't. They just fed it silence. John set his mug down. And now? It will expand. Slowly. At first, you'll see changes. Soil composition, electrical, interference. Then dreams. People may start feeling connected. Connected to what? The man looked toward the barn. To something older than language. A pause stretched between them. Why tell me any of this? John asked. Because it chose you, the man said. Recognition means imprinting. You opened the vessel. That means it remembers through you now. John's chest tightened. So, what am I supposed to do? The man stood. Live your life. Guard your land. And when the voices come, listen carefully. Because not all seeds bring flowers. Some bring fire. With that, he returned to the van. The convoy turned, rolled back down the dirt road, and vanished into the haze of mid-morning. John stood alone again. Weeks passed. Then months. The land changed. Crops grew faster. The soil stayed warm long after the sun had set. Animals grew quiet near the barn. And at night, John sometimes heard music from beneath the floorboards, a low hum, like a hymn sung through stone. He began to write. Not a journal. Not exactly. Just thoughts. Patterns. Dreams he didn't understand. Phrases in languages he couldn't place. But it brought him peace, in an odd way. Like tending a crop you didn't plant but somehow understood. He never saw the man in the cornfield again. But sometimes, just before sleep, he would see shadows in the hallway. Not men, not beasts, but shapes. Leaning in, listening. He didn't speak to them. But he didn't fear them either. Because somehow, deep in his blood, in the soil beneath his home, in the words left behind by a grandfather who tried to keep the world safe by burying it, John understood. This was never about ownership. It was about stewardship. Some things aren't meant to be controlled. Some things are meant to be remembered. And so, every morning, before the sun rose, John would walk to the barn, stand over the hidden door, and whisper 4 simple words. I haven't forgotten you. And from beneath, the earth, something always whispered back.